so happy tonight to introduce one of the long-term board members of the Friends of the Lincoln Collection who has been instrumental to bringing these lectures to us for many years. Please give a warm welcome and appreciation to Mr. Al Zacker.
Well, I'm here to welcome all of you attending our program of the Lincoln Collection of Indiana. And also been involved with McMurtry for many years. If the members of the board of the Friends of the Lincoln Collection would stand, I would greatly appreciate it. I hope I have some of you here. And now a special welcome to Bill Bartelt, the director of the Friends of the Lincoln Collection and the foremost authority on Abraham Lincoln's life in Indiana. And he will introduce our 42nd McMurtry Lecturer.
Thank you, Al, not only for the introduction, but for all you do for the Friends of the Lincoln Collection, and especially for your work in organizing events like the one this evening. Your work is really appreciated, so thank you. Our speaker this evening is Ronald C. White, author of the New York Times bestselling presidential biographies, A. Lincoln, a biography, and American Ulysses, a Life of Ulysses S. Grant. Among his other Lincoln's books is one of my favorites, Lincoln's Greatest Speech, the Second Inaugural. His most recent work is entitled, I have it here, and you have, well, you did have it there. This is the most recent one, which is entitled Lincoln in Private, What His Most Personal Reflections Tell Us About Our Greatest President. The Wall Street Journal hailed it as an intimate character portrait and fascinating inquiry into the basis of Lincoln's energetic and curious mind. And this is actually the subject of the lecture this evening. Dr. White is a graduate of UCLA and Princeton Theological Seminary and has received a PhD in religion and history from Princeton University. He has taught and lectured on Lincoln around the world. He and his wife, Cynthia, live in Pasadena, California. So please join me in welcoming Ron White to deliver this year's Gerald McMurtry Lecture. Thanks, right.
Thank you, Al and Bill. I am a newcomer to the Rollin Collection. This lecture was originally scheduled to be in January, and I think the virus postponed that, so on this happy, warm day, I'm pleased to be here. I've been to many different Lincoln collections. I think this is absolutely distinctive. I love the way it is planned. I think it has the ability to reach out to young people, so I really commend it to you if you've not yet had that opportunity. I've been a McMurtry lecturer before. I've used the collection here on many occasions. I'm delighted to be back at Fort Wayne. Well, there have been a few slings and arrows tossed at Abraham Lincoln in the last year or two as other historical figures, but C-SPAN has done 4 presidential historian surveys in the 21st century. They do one every time there's a change of presidents. And in those 4 surveys, Abraham Lincoln ranks each time number 1. Some years ago, I was invited by the State Department to give lectures in Germany. People had been staying away from American embassies because of the war in Iraq. And I got a call from the State Department, and they said, we think we can bring people back. What we want to start with is soft diplomacy. And I said, well, what is soft diplomacy? They said, Abraham Lincoln. So the first presentation I gave was to 12th and 13th grade teachers in Hamburg, Germany. And I said, let me start with a question to you. I said, why are you interested in Lincoln? And the response was, well, we know American history, and my goodness, do they know American history in Germany and every single European country. But George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are very much like the people in our history, what we would call well-born or patrician. For us, Abraham Lincoln is America. He represents what America is all about, that you can start with nothing and that you can rise. So we are more interested in Abraham Lincoln than any other American. I've never forgotten the comment of those German teachers. Tonight I want to introduce you to Lincoln in private. I think we know a great deal about the public Lincoln. I think in coming to Fort Wayne, I'm probably preaching to the choir. We know the Lincoln who offered the Gettysburg Address, the second inaugural address. We know the Lincoln who led this nation through the Civil War. But yet I think there's a private Lincoln that we have not really known and deserve to know more. It was 1863, spring. The Civil War was not going well. It was beginning to be called Mr. Lincoln's War, a term of derision. And there were protests, yes, protest meetings all across the nation, led by what were called peace Democrats. And these protest meetings were claiming that Lincoln had become a tyrant, that the war was not going well, and they wanted to return the nation to what they said, the nation as it was, the nation as it was. What they meant was the nation with slavery. So one protest meeting took place in Albany, New York, and what often happened after these protest meetings is in Albany they wrote what they called the Albany Resolves, and they sent them to Lincoln. Now Lincoln was ready to respond. He wrote what were called public letters. By public, he meant he would send them to a newspaper, a well-known newspaper, and then they would be published all across the country. So one afternoon, after he'd received the Albany Resolves, he was writing in his office, and a young Iowa congressman, James Wilson, entered the office, and watching Lincoln at work, he said, "Oh my goodness, this is amazing that you can simply sit down and from scratch write one of these eloquent public letters again." And Lincoln said, "Oh no." He demurred. He looked over there at at the top drawer of his desk, and he said, "It's all in there. It's all in disconnected thoughts. I never let those ideas escape me." The point of my book is they've escaped us. Oh, we know a few of these. Our best Lincoln historians and biographers have used some of these. I contacted the Lincoln Papers Project, an ongoing papers project in Springfield, and I said, "How many of these notes do we have?" They said 111. 111 have survived. So in the appendix to my book, for the first time ever, all 111 are printed. Now, sometimes these notes are called fragments, because just like you and me, Lincoln, I think, was writing the note and somebody entered his office, his child called, Mary called, and he stops in the middle of the word, even in the middle of a sentence. He doesn't complete the sentence. You will see this in the one I put up here to look at first. And so they are fragmentary. But I think they tell us something about the private Lincoln. Let's refresh our memories. You know this story. Lincoln was born in 1809 in Kentucky, moved to Indiana in 1816, to Illinois in 1830, and then settled first in New Salem and then in Springfield. But in that journey, Lincoln was growing and maturing and working out his thoughts. He had only 1 year of formal education. Boys only received education in maybe January, February, when it was too cold to work on farms with their fathers. But growing up in that milieu of both Kentucky and southern Indiana, it was what was called the Second Great Awakening. It was a very emotional kind of religion, and Lincoln reacted against it. He, to the consternation of his father, would stand outside of the Baptist churches and repeat the minister's sermons word for word until the father hit him on the backside and told him to get home. So Lincoln determined from a young age he would become a rational person, a thoughtful person. So Lincoln almost never shared his feelings, but he does in Lincoln in Private, because he never thought we'd ever see these notes. These notes, let me be sure to understand them, are never titled, never dated, never signed, because he never thought we would be looking them in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We know they're his by his distinctive handwriting. And although letters have surfaced in recent years, brought into libraries or one to the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago, because someone finds it in their attic and it's signed usually A. Lincoln, it might be signed Abraham Lincoln. Well, Lincoln didn't sign them, so you or your grandparents might have found it in their attic, I doubt that, but they would never know it was Lincoln, and so we probably will find no more. During the questions and comments, I might want to say more about how did he write them and when did he write them. We have only one from the 1830s, 6 from the 1840s. Remember, he was kind of an itinerant person, sleeping in the back storeroom at New Salem, boarding with families, not a great way to keep notes to yourself. But then they mushroom in the 1850s as he re-enters politics and the great issue of slavery comes forward. So let's look at some of these notes this evening. Let's see what they say. The first note that I want to call your attention to is the one on the screen. Nope, we'll go back to the previous one. I can or you can. Yeah, Here we are. As I said, Lincoln is often thought of as this very rational person. And so we don't see an emotional or lyrical side to him. I find this note one of the most remarkable. In 1848, while he is still a member of Congress, he travels up to Boston to campaign for the then Whig candidate. The Whigs were the predecessors of the Republicans, Zacker Taylor. And on the way home, he wants to take Mary and the children to Niagara Falls. Now, even in the early 19th century, America felt a real inferiority complex to both Europe and England. We didn't have the kind of culture, the kind of literature, the kind of music that they did, but we had something they didn't have. We had what would become national parks, wonderful beauty. Oh, not yet Yellowstone or Glacier or Yosemite. We had Niagara Falls. This was the most distinctive thing that America could claim. And everybody was flocking to Niagara Falls to see this natural beauty. And so did Lincoln. And he comes to Niagara Falls with his family, and while he's there, he writes this note. It's a remarkable note. Let's just take a look at it here at the very beginning. And I will read it here out of my book just to be sure. Actually, you can see the handwriting is very quite easy. Niagara Falls. By what mysterious power is it that millions and millions are drawn from all parts of the world to gaze upon Niagara Falls? There is no mystery about the thing itself. Every effect is such as any intelligent man knowing the causes would anticipate without seeing it. Well, it's a pretty long note, so I want to skip down to the end of this note and tell you what I think Lincoln is trying to say and do here. But still there is more. It calls up the indefinite past, when Columbus first sought this continent, when Christ suffered on the cross, when Moses led Israel through the Red Sea, nay, even when Adam first came from the hand of his Maker, then as now Niagara was roaring here. The eyes of the species of extinct giants, whose bones fill the mounds of America, have gazed on Niagara as ours do now. Contemporary with the whole race of men and older than the first man, Niagara is strong and fresh today as 10,000 years ago. The mammoth and the mastodon, now so long dead that fragments of their monstrous bones alone testify that they ever lived, have gazed on Niagara. In that long, long time, never still for a single moment, never dried, never froze, never slept, never rested, comma, He's not finished, but this is all we have. Well, William Herndon presented himself after Lincoln's death as the great interpreter of Lincoln. I know Abraham Lincoln better than any person because I served with him as a lawyer. So Lincoln comes home to Springfield, and Herndon had recently been to Niagara. So Herndon writes these words about Lincoln, the man he knows better than anybody else. He had no eye for the magnificence and grandeur of the scene, for the rapids, the mist, the angry waters, and the roar of the whirlpool. This Lincoln, according to Herndon, was heedless of beauty or awe. Wait just a second. Obviously, Herndon had never read Lincoln's note on Niagara. It's beautiful. It's lyrical. It's poetic. It's not the public Lincoln. It's the private Lincoln that he never, ever thought we would read. Well, you know that he served one term in Congress. He took an unpopular stand against the war in Mexico. He challenged James Polk, president, saying, you better understand, you sit where Washington sat. He said, I don't believe for a moment that the Mexicans started this war. The Americans started this war. Show me the spot where the Mexicans crossed the Rio Grande. So he went home to Springfield, and although many Whigs took a similar position, many people said to him, I don't appreciate the fact that you've called our president a traitor, and Lincoln thought in many ways his political career was over. So he became a full-time lawyer from 1849 to 1854. But then with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, put through Congress by the Illinois Senator, Stephen Douglas, it began to open up the possibility that slavery could extend to the West. So Lincoln is enraged by this. But he doesn't speak or write right away. The same with the Dred Scott decision. He takes months before he will speak in public. I don't know what he'd do with a 24/7 news cycle. I don't like that cycle myself. He takes time and he writes these notes to himself. Now, I said 111 of them are known to exist. 110 are in Springfield because they digitized all the collections. But last month, I had the great privilege of speaking for the White House Historical Association in Dallas, Texas. Every 4 years, this association, founded by Jacqueline Kennedy, puts on a summit to help our libraries from across the country learn how to present their findings, to raise money, whatever. And I was asked to speak in the home of a man who has an incredible private library, a full-time curator. His greatest possession is the fragment we're going to look at next. It's absolutely incredible. Lincoln, the whole understanding of Lincoln today, so misunderstood, and the whole topic of what he thought about slavery or what he thought about race. Listen to this fragment. We can see it together. It's 1854. Notice, well, you don't see it here, but often the fragment in the book will say question mark. Because remember I said it's not dated. So we're not exactly sure when he's written this, but Nicolay and Hay, his first secretaries, gave a date. Roy Basler in the 1950s, who did his volume, he gives a date. Usually it's the same date as Nicolay and Hay. It's a suggestion of what the date could be. This is Abraham Lincoln at his best. Gentleman Harlan Crow says, of all the possessions I have, of every single American president, this is the best document I have in my entire collection. I would agree. If A can prove, however, let me read it here so I get it sure. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may of right enslave B, why may not B snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? Oh, you say A is white and B is black. It is color, then, the lighter. And notice how Lincoln underlines. This is a habit of his. He will underline in the Gettysburg Address. He will underline in the Second Inaugural. I think Lincoln, if he had an alternative career, would have been a Shakespearean actor. He really was a phenomenal speaker with his high tenor voice. If he were here tonight, he'd be 6'9" or 6'10". People in the 19th century were much smaller than people are today. You say A is white and B is black. It is color, then, the lighter, having the right to enslave the darker. Take care. By this rule, you are to be a slave to the first man you meet, with a fairer skin than your own. Lincoln spent 24 years as a lawyer, only 12 years as an elected politician. I hear a lawyer arguing this case. You do not mean color exactly. You mean whites are intellectually the superiors to blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. By this rule, you are to be a slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But say you, it's a question of interest. He really sort of means here economic interest. Interest. And if you can make it your interest, you have the right to enslave another. Very well. And if he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. You hear the logical Lincoln here? Almost a syllogism, arguing this out. I expected, and you might want to ask, well, did these notes then make it into his public speeches? For the most part, no. This was, I think, a man of incredible intellectual curiosity, teasing out these ideas. I would like to say that I would like to elect people in political office who have intellectual curiosity. I was so impressed when I was in Germany of how many politicians there have PhDs who are so well educated. It's not that I made a lot of money in real estate and I can self-fund my campaign. It's because I have something to offer because I'm a deep-thinking, thoughtful person. And this is what Abraham Lincoln presents. Well, I said at the outset that Lincoln often didn't share his feelings, and that's true, but he did share his feelings on one occasion to himself, the private Lincoln, never thinking we would ever see this. In 1855, he runs for the Senate, and you'll remember that senators were elected until the early 20th century by state legislatures, and he led on the first 7 ballots. And he was running against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, against the extension of slavery into the territories. But by the 7th ballot, his vote total began to decline, although he led on the first 6 ballots. And what he worried him was there was another Republican, believe it or not, who was for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So against the advice of his handlers, he said, I'm going to pull my vote and I'm going to give them to this Democrat who's against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Democrat won the senatorial election, Lyman Trumbull, who ultimately becomes a Republican. So publicly, Lincoln was fine. I'm okay, Trumbull won. That sort of is a defeat for Stephen Douglas. Everything is okay. Not so private. Lincoln writes this note to himself. 22 years ago, Stephen Douglas and I first became acquainted. We were both young then, he a trifle younger than I. Even then, we were both ambitious, I perhaps quite as much as he. With me, the race of ambition has been a failure, a flat failure. With him, it has been one of splendid success. Let me read that again. In less than 4 years, Abraham Lincoln will be president. With me, the race of ambition has been a failure, flat failure. He never said that in public, but this is the way he felt when he lost that senatorial election, because his greatest goal in life was to become a United States Senator from Illinois, not to become president. He wasn't thinking that at all. But if he could become senator, that would be the high point of his ambition. Well, another interesting fragment, very, very brief, let's look at now. And this contains the story of Mary Lincoln. Mary Lincoln is not getting very good press these days. I'm a little more sympathetic to her. She lost her son Eddie at 3 1/2 in 1850. She loses Willie in 1862 at age 11. She perhaps is holding her husband's hand at Ford's Theater when he's assassinated. She will lose Tad at age 17. And so one day in a Chicago courtroom, she sits in silence as 12 men in the jury decide in 15 minutes that she's insane. And they put her into the female insane asylum at Bellevue, Illinois. Well, fortunately for her, a wonderful female lawyer, but I have to kind of qualify that, for when I say female lawyer, why would I qualify that? This woman had applied to become a lawyer, and when she put her application forward, she was told that women should not become lawyers because a chief vocation of a woman is to be a wife and a mother, and therefore they took down her application to be a lawyer. She appealed it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed. Women should not be lawyers because they're supposed to be wives and mothers, and they can't possibly do both. Isn't that interesting? Well, Myra Bradwell, really a lawyer, put it as her quest to get Mary Lincoln out of Bellevue and to restore to her the right taken away by her son Robert to control her own finances. And after a campaign of 5 or 6 weeks, also with her husband, who was a graduate of Knox College, she was able to free Mary Lincoln. And in doing so, Mary Lincoln was so grateful, she gave her a number of gifts that had been given to her husband by different potentates and rulers from around the world, but she gave her this fragment. And I think it's the most remarkable fragment. It's so brief, so concise, but it's remarkable. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. Now, Lincoln, in his journey with slavery, had come to the conclusion that slavery was terrible for African Americans. It took him some more time to really come to the understanding, which many people didn't understand, slavery is terrible for white people. It's terrible for the entire country. So this is the burden of this definition. The editors dated it as 1858. We don't know why she had it in her hand. You might have asked, and I should have said, what happened to these fragments? Well, when Lincoln was assassinated, his young secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolay, were asked to gather them all up and collect them, and then one day they would be given back to them to write their remarkable biography. So here we have this fragment, and I want to just notice one thing in particular. Lincoln's use of the negative. Douglas Wilson, a wonderful Lincoln scholar at Knox College, has pointed out that Lincoln, like Shakespeare, was very fond of using the negative. You might think that if you were going to present an idea, you would want to use the positive. But Douglas Wilson says Lincoln was very adept at using the negative. Go back and read the Gettysburg Address and think of how many negatives are in that Gettysburg Address to make this point. This is really quite a profound statement of his understanding of democracy. So succinct. Well, in the rest of the book, there's a lot of other dimensions of Lincoln, the birth of the Republican Party, the whole question of slavery. He is interesting in the fact that while he's doing the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he's reading books on pro-slavery. So when Lincoln comes home from that term in Congress, Herndon wants him to begin subscribing to newspapers that are national newspapers. And Herndon says to him, well, I think we should subscribe to some anti-slavery newspaper. And Lincoln said, well, that's a very good idea. But then Lincoln says to Herndon, I think we ought to subscribe also to the leading newspaper of Richmond, Virginia, and Charleston, South Carolina. And Herndon says, well, why in the world would we do that? And Lincoln says, because we need both sides of the table. Both sides of the table. To me, one of the saddest parts of our present demise is we don't have both sides of the table. Each of us, we're going to read this newspaper or that newspaper. We're going to watch this TV channel or that TV channel. In Lincoln's day, I'm sure many of you know this, there was a Republican paper and a Democratic paper. So in Chicago, you had the Republican Tribune and you had the Democratic Times. But Lincoln and many, many, many people like him subscribed to both. They wanted to read both sides at the table so they could make up their mind. So this is what Lincoln was all about. So he reads two different books on pro-slavery while he's giving while he's preparing to give lectures on debate with Stephen Douglas. He reads one by a Presbyterian minister who had written this book, Slavery Ordained by God. He never uses the book by Frederick Ross in the debates, but this is what he writes at the end. But slavery is good for some people, triple exclamation point. As a good thing, slavery is strikingly peculiar in this, that is the only good thing which no man ever seeks the good of for himself. Nonsense! You can hear Lincoln's anger rising with an exclamation point. Wolves devouring lambs, not because it's good for their own greedy maws, but because it is good for the lambs, triple exclamation point. I learned, actually, after I wrote my book, Lincoln's Greatest Speech, that Lincoln had a habit of saying the words out loud before he put them to paper. Did you know that before 100 years ago, everybody always read out loud? I don't know how the habit changed. Maybe it was a summer day in Fort Wayne, and the teacher was saying, Johnny, you're disturbing Mary, read to yourself. And we've taken up this bad habit of reading silently. Lincoln said, I read out loud so I can read with two senses, the sense of the eye and the sense of the ear. Many years ago, when I was doing 1 year of graduate study in England, we were traveling through England, and we stopped at a kind of a hotel, and there was a big parlor room, and we went in there after dinner, and everybody was reading out loud. I thought, what an odd sensation. They were all reading out loud to each other. Well, you've read out loud to your children or your grandchildren. Lincoln read out loud, Grant read out loud, everybody read out loud. Lincoln had a sense of this. One other element before we open this up for your comments and questions. To me, one of the enigmas of Lincoln's life is his whole understanding of religion. We have given him credit for progressing or moving or changing his ideas on slavery, on politics, on many different things, but somehow we have freeze-framed him back at the beginning. For if you remember not liking the sermons in the Second Great Awakening, when he gets to New Salem, he actually writes a paper criticizing what he calls revealed religion. We would call it criticizing the Bible. And someone, and there's many testimonies to this, witnesses that say he did this, someone ripped it out of his hand, threw it into the fire. Not a smart thing to do if you're an aspiring politician. But then what happened to Lincoln is what happens to all of us as we age. Life tumbles in. First, it's Eddie, who dies in 1850 at 3.5 years of age. Lincoln reaches out for Charles Dresser, the Episcopal minister who had married them. He's out of town. But he learns that there's a new young Presbyterian minister. He's only been there 9 months, James Smith, and he invites James Smith into his home to do the funeral service. Then Willie dies in 1862. Now Lincoln arrives in Washington, and I say the missing person in the Lincoln story is the minister of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, Phineas Densmore Gurley, number 1 in his class at Princeton Seminary. He does the funeral service for Willie. And I almost imagine him leaning forward, and he says to Abraham Lincoln, Mary's not there, she's so overcome with grief, I ask you to trust in biblical providence. Well, we get to the second inaugural, and to the surprise of everyone, then and now, in 701 words, Lincoln mentions God 14 times, quotes the Bible 4 times, and invokes prayer 3 times. Well, when I started into studying Lincoln, I was kind of a Johnny-come-lately. This was not a lifetime passion. My academic friends said, don't get too excited. Inaugural addresses always quote the Bible. So I looked it up. The previous 18 addresses, the Bible was quoted 1 time. John Quincy Adams, the Psalms, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Where did this come from? I think it comes from this note, which no one knew existed on March 4, 1865, when Lincoln delivers his second inaugural address. Let me set the scene for us. It is August of 1862. The North has lost yet another terrible war, the Second Battle of Manassas or Bull Run. Lincoln convenes an emergency cabinet meeting. Fortunately for us, 3 of his cabinet secretaries kept diaries. And one of them wrote down in his diary, Lincoln said he was overcome with the bitterest of anguish. He almost thought of hanging himself. Almost thought of hanging himself. And then we believe, not sure, it's not dated, that afternoon Lincoln sits down and writes this remarkable fragment. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, and one must be wrong. Hear the logical Lincoln here. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. And then this remarkable sentence. In the present civil war, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And yet the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. I'm almost ready to say this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet. By his mere quiet power, Lincoln had long since not liked a noisy God that he met as a young person. By his mere quiet power on the minds of the now contestants, he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. Notice the underline. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. President Abraham Lincoln, are you suggesting that God might give the victory to the Confederacy? You better not say that out loud. And he doesn't. He simply says it to himself, knowing we will never read this. Yet the contest proceeds. In the final chapter, I've chosen 12 fragments to look at in 10 chapters. I line up in parallel spaces the argument of the meditation on the divine will and the argument of the meditation on the divine will, and show what I believe is one is the foundation of the other. One, the meditation is very theological, very philosophical. The inaugural speech, second, will become much more flesh and blood, destroyed by the lash, spilled by the blood, but they cohere together. I conclude with this story or stories. One of my greatest joys, and this is why I like the new center that you've put together here in the library, is how to reach young people. I'm looking around here. I don't know that we have anybody in high school who's here. Maybe we do. I hope we do. Anyway, I've spoken to many, many high schools from Massachusetts to Hawaii, and I'm often speaking to 11th graders who are studying United States history, and I love to share these fragments or notes with them. And then I'll ask them this question. Oh, I didn't bring my phone with me, but they have their phone. It's like it's attached to their hand. I said, how long do you think it took Lincoln to write these notes? And they'll say, oh, a minute, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. And then I suggest, how about an hour? 2. To have this kind of deep thinking takes a lot of time and space to do this. In one school, when I said that, the faculty was all applauding in the back of the room. What are we saying here? We're saying that the private Lincoln models for us, even more than the public Lincoln, the kind of intellectual curiosity that I think is at the hallmark of why he's so great. We hear him sharing some of his feelings, the feeling of being defeated, the feeling of feeling like his life is a failure. A lyrical side of him in that fragment on Niagara Falls, almost poetic, which his best friend Herndon doesn't get at all. Oh, we haven't even talked about the birth of the Republican Party, the relationship of the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution, and on and on and on. I encourage you, if you choose to buy this book, to be sure to just leaf through the appendix. When he gets to the White House, he does date them, he does sign them, but there are some remarkable ones that he does at the White House. So what are we saying here? We come here tonight, I think, because all of us have an appreciation of Abraham Lincoln. Probably many of you have read many books about Lincoln. But I think this opens up a window on Lincoln, what I call the private Lincoln, that offers us a different viewpoint to even enhance who he is as an American leader. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that thought presentation. Dr. White has agreed to handle some questions. And if you are watching online, please submit your questions. Here in the audience, Kurt or someone here has a microphone, and they will come to you and allow you to ask the question. Now, while we're waiting for this, I'd like to ask you for you to share your most recent project, the one you're working on now.
Okay. Well, often when you have the privilege of speaking to an audience such as you this evening, someone will say, "And what is your next book?" So I was speaking in 2016 when I finished my biography of American Ulysses, Ulysses S. Grant. And I was speaking at the Jonathan Club in downtown Los Angeles, the oldest private club, and somebody said, "And what is your next book?" And I said, "Well, I'm not exactly sure." And this fellow in the back of the audience says, "I know what it is." I said, "You do?" "Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain." Well, I wasn't totally sure of who he is. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is that man written about in the novel Killer Angels, in Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, in the movie Gettysburg. The Bowdoin College professor who at age 32 said, "This war cannot be fought by the boys in my classroom. It must also be fought by people like me." So he goes to the governor and volunteers himself, and the governor said, "I'll make you colonel." That's what they did, He said, "No, I don't deserve to be a colonel. Make me lieutenant colonel. And maybe one day I will deserve to be colonel when I learn how to do this job." He gets to Gettysburg, Little Round Top, second day, far left of the Union line. His men have run out of ammunition, and the Confederates from Alabama and Texas are charging up the hill. He commands, "Fix your bayonets," and they charge down the hill and rout and defeat the Confederate soldiers. He goes on to become governor of Maine 4 times, president of Bowdoin College. As a student in college, he learned 7 languages. As a student at Bangor Theological Seminary, because his mother wanted him to be a minister, he learned another 2 languages. He only knew 9. He's the most remarkable public speaker. At Petersburg 1 year later, I'm answering this too long, I'll stop. At Petersburg 1 year later, he is wounded so severely that 2 surgeons tell him he will die, and asking that he could dictate a letter he writes to his wife telling her that he will die, but do not grieve for him. Grant hears this story and for the first time in the Civil War promotes him on the spot because Grant had learned of the incredible courage of this man. So it's been fun to do. I'm about finished, 19 chapters. I'm in chapter 19. Hopefully it'll be published at late 2023.
I think we can see how you think. All right, question.
Does Lincoln keep a diary? Did he write the stuff he kept? Did he keep a diary?
Great question. Did Lincoln keep a diary? We have no knowledge of a diary. And obviously Lincoln didn't live to write his reminiscences, like Grant's great reminiscences. So that's why, again, I think this is all the more important. There's no diary, and there's no reminiscence, no memoir. So this is I call it Lincoln's intellectual diary. It's not about his wife. It's not about his children. When they left Springfield for Washington in February of 1861, Mary went out, and this is what people did in the 19th century. She had what she called her burn pile, and she burned all these papers. Men and women burned the correspondence between them, his husband and his wife. This was private. You don't want somebody reading your correspondence. Maybe Lincoln burned some of his papers. I think maybe his son, Robert, might have thought, well, these are not public papers. He'd been the custodian of them for 50 years after Lincoln's death. He may not have kept them. But we have 111, and they tell us a great deal about Lincoln. Thank you.
Question?
Thank you, Dr. White.
Yes.
Could you speak maybe briefly on how you went about dating and sequencing these fragments? And then did you find any of the later fragments that contradicted or said something opposite of what he had said previously?
All right, there's 2 parts of that. How did the dating? For the most part, I accepted the dating of previous editors. In one particular place, when Lincoln comes back from his years in Congress and becomes a full-time lawyer, he has this remarkable thing called Notes for a Law Lecture. Last month, I gave a lecture to the Baylor University School of Law, and the editor is dated at 1850. I can't believe that Lincoln would be so audacious to do this within 1 year after he started his law practice again. So I think it's later. but it's very difficult to date them. The second part of the question was again? Oh, did it contradict? I wouldn't say the question is, did it contradict? I don't say that it would contradict, but you can see Lincoln growing, even as I've indicated in the earlier definition of democracy. His understanding of what slavery is doing to America. At first, it's what it's doing to African Americans. But now he's realizing the further along he gets, what it's doing to the whole body politic. So I would say it's that sort of thing. And Lincoln is a late comer to the Republican Party. Probably the party was born in 1854. He doesn't come aboard till 1856. And he believes that the party is not taking seriously the charge that it's a sectional party, because the Whig Party was a national party, and the Republican Party is basically a northern party. So he takes it upon himself to write an extended note on how to defend the Republican Party, which at one level is a sectional, but which he is going to argue is a national party. So it's that sort of thing that he's taking issue with, maybe what was the perceived logic of his own party, and maybe taking a different take on it. Thank you.
Do we have any questions?
Yes, please.
With this magic voice. We have a question here.
The question is, am I responsible for the coloration of Lincoln on the front cover of my book? Yeah. No, I'm not. I'm privileged to be published by Random House, which is a great publisher. And what I was really pleased with, it's very expensive to have in the middle of this book all of these fragments in their true color. And they went to bat to do this, so that you can see Lincoln is writing on all different kinds of paper. The Meditation on the Divine Will is written on paper with blue lines in it, you know. And if they'd have just done this in black and white, I think we wouldn't have caught the variety by which he does this. So I give credit to the publisher. I think the cover of American Ulysses was a great cover. They colorized an earlier photograph, but I don't take any credit for that. Yes, anybody online? I don't know if we can read from the chat room or something like that?
A couple questions online. I have one here. It says, do any notes exist on Lincoln's meetings with African American civil rights leaders, i.e. the New Orleans delegation in 1864?
That's a wonderful question. Do the notes reveal Lincoln's working with African American leaders? My friend Jonathan White has just come out with a wonderful book called The House That Slaves Built, telling the story far more than any of us knew of the many, many African American visitors to the White House, either invited by Lincoln or showing up without invitation. But the notes do not speak specifically of some of those encounters, especially the dramatic encounter in August, I think it was 1862, where Lincoln seems to be putting down these people or telling them they all should move to Africa. That's been brought up by all the slings and arrows against Lincoln in the last 2 years. The notes don't really deal with that. Was there another one?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Dr. White, if I could, I'd like to take a little bit of diversion from tonight's topic, but go to American Ulysses.
Yes.
Which was a phenomenal book on Grant. I think brought about a lot of stuff.
I
that people
planted
didn't know.
this man right here in the third row.
But knowing I was going to have this opportunity, the one thing that enormously struck me in the book was your depiction of Grant, particularly in the mobile Western campaigns, how at the end of the night, he'd be with a couple of staff people, and they would just like eat whatever they had in their pocket, drop down on the ground under a tree and just sleep. Now that's not the way that I pick a commanding general in the field. And I just wonder, was that atypical and you just happened to pick out a couple instances? Was that typical of Grant and not typical of other commanders? And if it was typical of Grant, what's that say about his leadership style?
What a great comment and question. Well, remember that Grant served in the war with Mexico, and he observed two different styles of commanding. Winfield Scott was all fuss and feathers. He would arrive with his entourage and his self-made beautiful uniform. Zachary Taylor just arrived kind of in an old hat, looked like an Indiana farmer, pardon me, but that was the way someone described him. And Grant decided there and then he would not be Winfield Scott. He said Winfield Scott led the troops, Zachary Taylor was with the troops. So Grant determined that he would be a commander with the troops. When he starts out on the Overland Campaign in May, really the spring of 1864, he's located very close to George Meade, who's leading the Army of the Potomac. And George Meade has this big flag outside of his tent. And Grant says, "Is Caesar here?" And within a day, Meade took it down. And Grant, of course, we know the famous story of Appomattox where, Grant wore a private's uniform. He almost never wore a general's uniform. And the only way you would know he was a general was because he had the stars on his shoulder. And my favorite story of all, and I'm going to have a chance to say this in front of the Capitol on April 26th, is he arrives in Washington, he checks into Willard's Hotel, they called it a Willard's then, with his son. He walks up to the desk and says, "Could I have a room?" And he says, "Sir, don't you understand? This is the greatest hotel in Washington. This is civil. Who do you think you are?" "Okay, I can give you a small room on the 6th floor, the top floor." Grant says, "That will be fine." The desk clerk turns the circular around, and Grant had signed it, U.S. Grant and Son, Galena, Illinois. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" "Well, today, don't you know who I am?" Grant would never have said that. He would never have said that. And that, to me, it really endears him to me. He says to Sherman after he's elected, he said, "I did not want to be elected. It was forced upon me. But if I wasn't elected, we would forfeit everything that we had earned in the Civil War." And Andrew Johnson had almost forfeited everything. So this is, I think, what's such an endearing quality. Can you combine in political leaders, and this is the test for every one of them, ambition, there's nothing wrong with ambition, and humility. And both Lincoln and Grant, I believe, could combine ambition and humility. And that's why they're so great. Yeah?
We'd be remiss if we didn't point out that you probably are going to give us speeches as Lincoln speeches, and you might want to explain to the people why.
Yeah. April 20, this is the Grant bicentennial. April 27 is Grant's 200th birthday. And the Capitol Historical Society on April 26, Congress comes back and starts at noon on a Tuesday. So at 10:30, there is a huge Grant Memorial in Washington, unknown to most of us. It's the largest equestrian statue in the United States. We're going to have a ceremony there with a Capitol architect, with Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri, and then they've asked me to speak about Grant in that context. That evening, the 26th, I'm going to speak at the Union League Club of Philadelphia. The next night, with General David Petraeus and Ron Chernow speaking about Grant in New York, and 28th, the Union League Club of New York. What are Union League clubs? These were founded in 1862 and 63 to support the Union, and they've continued to this day. So Grant has risen 13 places in the 21st century C-SPAN presidential historian surveys. There have been 4 of them. He's risen 13 places. And that includes the 3 21st century presidents, Bush, Obama, Trump. Eisenhower is second. He's risen 4 places. But this is remarkable. Grant is suddenly, I think, getting his due. As my editor said, don't you think he's due for an upgrade? He's getting it.
Any more online questions?
Yeah, I got 3 now. We're getting them coming in a little bit.
Okay.
So the next one is, what can Lincoln teach us today?
Whew, that's a broad question, isn't it? What can Lincoln teach us today? I think the reason that we study history is filled with examples. And I always want to say to audiences, and I failed to say that tonight, that Lincoln is a 19th century person. He cannot help us with climate change. He can't tell what we should do in Ukraine. And all those who want to rip his name off of public schools forget that he's a 19th century person. And he's evolving. People owned slaves in the 19th century. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. People actually did own slaves in the 18th century. It wasn't unusual. But Lincoln offers ability to be humble, to be magnanimous, to be a listener, to be respectful of those with whom he disagrees. And I think these are qualities very, very much needed today. Lincoln is not a neophyte in politics. I think the whole idea that people are now running on the basis, I have no experience, therefore you should elect me. Where Lincoln had a lot of experience, 4 terms in the Illinois State Legislature, 1 term in the United States Congress. He brought a lot of experience to this job.
Another question?
Yeah, the next one says, every time I read about Lincoln in the White House, I come away feeling as if Lincoln was the loneliest man alive. Do his fragments tell who could or ever really deeply confide in?
Oh, that's a powerful, interesting question. You come away with a feeling that Lincoln must have been the loneliest man in the world. David Donald, the great Harvard historian who wrote a wonderful biography of Lincoln, I heard him speak once on his book, Lincoln and His Friends, at the Smithsonian in Washington, and he said Lincoln didn't really have any friends. I think in many ways Lincoln was kind of a loner. We can argue about how successful or unsuccessful was his marriage. The most surprising friendship he had was with William Seward. Seward was a drinker, Lincoln was a teetotaler. Seward used profanity every sentence, Lincoln almost used none. But somehow they forged this friendship. So I think Lincoln's task to be president is a lonely, lonely task. When he takes an informal vote, whether they should resupply Fort Sumner, the vote is 6-2, don't do it. He decides to do it. So the task of being president is a lonely task, but I think he had a sort of inner direction, a sense not of arrogance, but of a confidence in his own judgment. So I wouldn't disagree with the fact that I think he was often a very lonely person. And you can almost see this in every chapter in my biography of Lincoln. You can watch him age. I mean, he was barely 56 when he died, but you can watch him age through those 4 years. Just amazing.
All right, and the last one I have here is, there are any notes that discuss Lincoln's thoughts on any members of Congress when he was president?
Any members of Congress? No, I don't think so. No, I would wish quickly to say he might have written those notes and maybe he put them in the burn pile. Maybe he didn't save them. But his notes are more about ideas than they are about persons. He mentions the 2 pro-slavery books that he's reading by Southern authors, so he's talking about specific people. But I don't think, and I have to think about this some more, whether he's talking about specific individuals. I don't think he does. No. It's a good question.
Any in-house question? I'm not talking.
Right.
How unique was it?
Yeah. The question, am I aware of any other president who had done what Lincoln has done here, write these notes? I am not. And one reason I think this is so interesting is that it's so unique, it's so distinctive. He didn't keep a diary, whether he would have written his memoir, we don't know. But these are absolutely distinctive in the way he goes about it. And I want to emphasize again, almost none of them ever make it into public speeches. This is just for his own thought process, his own use to think through these issues, which I think, again, but says so much about who he is as a person. Good question.
If there are no other questions, I want to thank you for a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
I always think the questions are the best part.
Yeah.
Not that the speech wasn't great, but it just shows us the depth that you have in these topics that you've written about. So let's thank him once again.
Production facilities provided by Access Fort Wayne. Learn more under the Explore tab at acpl.info.